DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. We talk about it a lot in our organizations to varying degrees of effect, but it's certainly top of mind as we move forward and try to build better workplaces. Now, when I bring up those words, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, does age factor into it? Does an older person or a very young person come into the equation when you think about inclusiveness? Well, my guest today wants you to really start thinking about it and get serious about it. Ageism in the workplace is our topic today. Hold on. This is Relationships at Work, the Employee Experience and Workplace Culture podcast. I'm Russell Lolliker with the burning question, which is, have you checked out Raw Notes yet? Oh my goodness, should you? The latest edition, which just dropped earlier this week, was about night owls. I was talking to former guest and a good friend of mine, Mike Vardy, who's a productivityist. That's his title for being a productivity expert. Needless to say, he's a night owl. And as we talked about what it's like to be a night owl, it was interesting because I don't think the workplace is designed for night owls. I don't think night owls are taken into consideration at all. Because all we talk about is the early bird gets the worm or don't send emails after hours. But if you're a night owl, it's not about showing up first. And it's certainly not sending emails as soon as 4:30, 5 o'clock, 5:30 comes around. It's doing it when it works for you and where your energy levels are. And in a world where we talk about diversity, inclusivity, why are we only praising the early risers? Why are we not including the night owls? Anyway, interesting thought. And I include that in the latest Raw Note, which I highly recommend you check out. Comes out every Thursday morning. If you want to sign up, just go over to russelllolliker.com. On the top right, you'll see a Get Your Raw Notes. Follow that button, and there you have it in your inbox. Night owls, maybe they aren't thought about, but something else that isn't thought about nearly enough is age. I mean young, I mean old, and understanding their role in the workplace and getting away from preconceived notions because people are ageist. There's ageism quite embedded in the workplace, and I don't think it's highlighted enough. So my guest today, Patti Temple Rocks, she is prepared to do something about it, and she wants to take you along for the ride. So before we get any further, let's talk to Patti. And on the show today, we have Patti Temple Rocks, and here is why she is awesome. She's a speaker and consultant with 4 decades of experience in marketing, PR, and advertising, and she's here because she's on a mission to eliminate ageism from the workplace and making sure age inclusivity is on every company's DEIB agenda. Her book, I'm Still Not Done, It's Time to Talk About Ageism in the Workplace, was one of Inc. magazine's 9 books every professional should read in 2019, and her work and story have been featured in Fast Company, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal. There's a lot to list. I'm not going to do it. Go Google yourself. Hi, Patti.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to have you here. So I have to start, before I get into the ageism conversation, besides the fact I'm going to stumble over that word every 5 seconds, what's your best or worst employee experience, Patti?
Well, I think it's both in a way. And so I'm sure I'm not the only one that's had one that was both. I was right out of school, first job out of college, very excited to get my business cards produced. My name, you introduced me. My full name is Patricia, which no one ever calls me unless I'm in trouble. And I had vacillated from Patti to Pat. And in college, I was more Pat. But when I started this job, I wanted to be Patti. So I put that on my business cards. And my then boss, his name was Phil, said, that's not a very professional name. I don't think you should go with Patti. I think you should go with Pat. And at the time, I didn't know that he was actually teaching me a very valuable lesson that I would carry through the rest of my career, which was to be authentic to myself. And so I said, no, I'm Patti, and I didn't change my business card. And that was what, my entire professional career I've been known at. But that whole, authenticity piece is something that I feel really proud of because I've carried it with me my entire career and never molded myself to fit some mold of what somebody thought a woman in business should be, or a person of a certain age should behave, or anything. I've always just felt super comfortable just being myself, and living my true self at work is super valuable and important.
It's funny because I'm sure that leader didn't think they were trying to do anything wrong. I think they were probably just looking out for you. But the biggest problem I always find is the word professionalism seems to always get in the way of people being themselves, people being able to show up as themselves at work, because of this, what professional looks or acts like seems very stuck in a different century, it seems almost sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, not the world we live in anymore. So I'm thankfully I live in that one.
Not at all.
Ageism, Patti. This is the focus of our conversation. I'm excited to get into it. So the first thing I always need to do is define terms. I have such a frustration with organizations that love using their buzzwords like diversity, inclusion, and leadership, but never actually defining what those mean, so people don't have any direction. So from your book, which you have a definition of ageism that you pulled from Ashton Applewhite, author of This Chair Rocks, which is when the dominant group uses its power to oppress or exploit or simply ignore people who are much younger or significantly older. Does this still resonate with you as the true definition?
Absolutely. And it was interesting, as I was telling you the story of my boss, Phil, like, I graduated from college when I was only 22. So I'm 22 starting my first job. That was also a bit of a power play on his part, and using his, age and, role in the company to kind of try to intimidate me. So what I love about Ashton's sort of definition is that it does make it clear ageism can happen on both ends of the spectrum. It is much more damaging and harmful when it happens at the upper age spectrum, which is why I have chosen to focus on that. It's also important to know that ageism is legally protected. Like, it is against the law to, you can be accused of ageism and lose a lot of money. And ageism we're federally protected. It's honestly over 40. But most of the predominance of lawsuits and things like that happen are over 50. But another term, if you don't mind, that I would throw out is ageist. And so ageism it's not black and white, because nothing about this topic is, but it is, it is defined legally. What I find happens more often than not is that people are just behaving in ageist ways, with stereotypes or behaviors or attitudes or things, that they're just making certain assumptions about somebody simply because of how old they are. And those don't always rise to the level of really, overt discrimination, but no discrimination starts without sort of ageist attitudes, behaviors, thinking.
And I want to get into some of those stereotypes in a moment. But first, I want to dig into the definition just a touch more, because it specifies 3 ways of ageism shows up, which is to oppress, to exploit, or ignore. So I was kind of hoping you'd give an example of each, just so people have an idea of what we're specifically talking about and how it shows up.
Sure. Well, I'll start with the one that I think is, the least obvious and the hardest to observe, or even if it's happening to you, sometimes to know it's happening to you. And that is this sort of dismissive thing that happens, and I call it marginalization, but it was really what sort of woke me up to this issue in the first place. And that was because a friend, mentor, happened to be my boss at the time, started to not be included in meetings that she had previously been included. She was talked over in certain instances, not sort of given a voice or a vote in things that she previously would have been. And so I witnessed it, and I wasn't quite sure. I couldn't articulate it. I wasn't sure what was happening. It was happening to her, and I don't think she fully understood what was happening. And I was at a work cocktail party with our shared boss, who was the CEO. And I said, I see something going on. What's happening with so-and-so? And I knew that he was, he'd put her in the job and felt like he was a supporter of her and would advocate for her. But what he said sort of blew my mind, which was, he said, well, she's been with the company for a long, long time now. Maybe she's just tired. And I knew her, nobody has ever used that word to describe her. Like, she's not tired. She wasn't tired then. She's still not tired. Like, that was not at all true. And so I thought, what is he trying to do? And that's when I realized that it was a bit of a euphemism for older. And she wasn't, she was like 55, I think. But that was sort of his way of creating a situation, a scenario where she could kind of be pushed into early retirement, and he and the organization could feel good about it. But there's nothing to feel good about that, because it is, had she wanted to, she could have, that's a legally protected piece of it as well. And it also just feels shitty. Nobody likes to feel invisible or undervalued. And especially if there's sort of no overt reason, why that would be happening to you. And it often leads to self-doubt, which then becomes this vicious cycle of, well, I don't, they're not asking my opinion anymore. So maybe maybe there's something wrong. I'm not as with it as I was. And so then I get quiet, and then, I'm having a review or a conversation with my boss who says, well, you just don't really contribute in meetings anymore, and so sorry, we have to let you go, so it really is just this really horrible thing. The more obvious exploitive things are when people just sort of say, no, I'm not going to give you this opportunity. You're too old. Or, this is a position that we have for our high potential people who are have a longer career track. We're not going to invest in this training for you because, let's face it, you're not going to be, here much longer. Again, people don't say those things out loud as often, very often, but it's usually sort of what is an active thought in their mind that is definitely, very direct and overt way of discriminating against somebody who's older.
And how horrible, and you highlight that, how horrible it is for their mental health when leaders aren't being leaders, not communicating, not explaining why changes are happening. So when, and as we often see in communications, if you don't say what's going on, people will fill in the story themselves. And
For sure.
all that self-doubt, all that. So that breaks my heart. But I want to look at it from a why. Why do people get into that ageism mindset to think that this is the right thing to do? What are the stereotypes? What are the myths that people are making assumptions about older people in the workplace?
I just don't think we've challenged it in a long time. I think that there are some of it literally, I think, is rooted in societal biases and beliefs about age. I mean, not that many of us send greeting cards anymore, but if you go down, a greeting card aisle, you will still find lots of cards that, make fun or poke fun at someone based on their age. There's 40s and 50s, and these different cards. And so we've sort of grown up thinking, well, there must be something kind of wrong with it if we can make a joke about it. If we look at who we see out there, like in commercials or in everything from like images, the standard stock images that we can find in photographies, they're younger people. Like, we are, as a culture and society, we tend to worship at the altar of youth. There's an entire multi-billion-dollar industry that's literally called anti-aging, selling products and cosmetics and potions and all these things to sort of, fend off aging, because aging is bad. And I think that, that's just flies in the face of logic. If you're aging, it means you're not dying. And, isn't every day that I age one day that I've escaped death? It's just all sort of crazy. And so I do think that there are just a lot of these biases. But in the workplace, to kind of let people off the hook a little bit, I just think it's a classic, like, if you didn't know it was a problem, how could you solve it? Or you didn't really do anything about it, which is partly why I wanted to get involved in this, because I think ageism just kind of went, undetected, unreported for decades. It is by far the most widely felt form of discrimination. If you ask people, like, have you ever experienced discrimination because of your age or witnessed it happening to somebody else? Same survey about, gender discrimination, racial discrimination. The age is way highest. It's also the least reported. So why is that? What's going on in the workplace? Well, I just don't think people were talking about it. Like, when you do, DE&I programs, like I'll flat out ask somebody, well, are you doing a segment on age? Oh no, we didn't really think about that, And so where I get optimistic in a way about all of this is that for many of these conversations I have with people, when they say, oh, yeah, no, we don't, they then go on to say, but we should. So I do think that it is a little bit of that whole Maya Angelou quote, which I love so much. When I knew better, I did better. And so I think some of it is just about us helping the workplace, which is my focus, see that you've just got some updating to do in your thinking. And it used to be, when a lot of these policies and things were set, that retiring at 55 was made sense because you were probably going to die at 70. So there was this attitude, and I know, like, I wish I could go back in time to career. I went to so many retirement, lunches or things like that, where I wish now I had said, did you want to retire? Because I bet at least 50% of them didn't and felt pushed into taking the package, early retirement or whatever. But when you're 30 and somebody's retiring or being, asked to retire in their 50s, frankly, that seems reasonable, and then until you get there and you're 40 and you're like, oh, that's only 15 years for me. I'm not going to be ready to retire by then. And, and so on and so on. Plus we're living so much longer now, and we have to be financially whole in ways that our predecessors did not, because of how long that money, sort of has to live. So companies just need to rethink everything and envision a workplace where they can have literally five generations of workers all contributing happily and productively, and it will be a much better place.
So I have to ask the why question again, because I'm sure there's some people listening going, okay, sure, we'll keep older generations in the workplace, but why should we? What is the benefit of keeping and not being ageist, not supporting ageism? What is the benefit of keeping older staff engaged in the workforce?
Well, a couple things. And first of all, you said a key $1 million word when you said engaged. So I am not here to argue, never will, never have, never will, that it is a entitlement to keep a job until a certain, but my mission, my goal would be for everybody to work as long as they want to, and to be able to set their own end date, but only if they're contributing value. This is not a charity. Like, we don't get to keep our jobs out of charity. So you have to stay in the game, and you have to stay engaged and contribute. But the main reason that we need older people in the workforce is because we have older people in the world. And so anyone's workforce is going to be better at delivering a product or service if they are represented by a cross-section of who is out there in the world. And older workers have, wisdom and experience, and that's not nothing. That can be incredibly valuable. I ended up, after I wrote my first book, I ended up going back to work, and at the time didn't know the pandemic was coming. Of course, none of us did, but I would say I've probably never worked harder in my life than I did during the pandemic. I was consulting and working with clients and all the rest of that. And I have never been more grateful for every tough thing I went through in my professional life, whether it was the dot-com bubble, 9/11, like all of these things that at the time we felt like, how are we going to survive as a business? Or what do I say to my people to make them not feel so scared? Or, what do our customers expect from us? All of these things, none of us had thought about them relative to the pandemic, but I had thought about them in many other somewhat similar types of experiences. And so when you have people in your organization that have, sort of been through things, they can be just such an asset to the younger people in the organization who just want to learn, and in my experience, by the way, it is not the 20 somethings and 30 somethings who are ageist. It is the ones that are right bumping up against that next age group, and they want them out of the way. So they use sort of ageist practices to get them out of the way. So I just think, I call it the special sauce of youth and experience can produce absolutely tremendous results in the workplace.
You brought up the pandemic and that it might not have been the best thing in the world for older baby boomer staff. How did you see the pandemic impact ageism?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it was definitely a spectrum of things that ended up with the Great Resignation, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think that, the early days of the pandemic, as you remember, and I'm sure all of us remember, we didn't know what the hell was happening. What is this going to, last forever? Is it going to, is it just nothing? What is it? And we certainly weren't getting a lot of consistent, solid things that were sort of helping us to understand it. But the one thing that seemed to be the first piece of news that gave us oddly a little bit of comfort was it seems to be hitting older people. And so, the nursing homes and all the rest of that. So number one, in the positive way, it sort of helped us to learn and understand and maybe mobilize and motivate to sort of help that. I know I was vigilant about everything, but especially vigilant about my mother, and making sure that she was not exposed to things and all the rest of that. But the downside of that was, of course, we later learned that, it could impact everybody. But the downside was, in a really callous way, there were some attitudes that were like, well, they're old, they're going to die anyway. And so it just kind of fed into this narrative about old people being frail, weak, lesser than. So I think it was very damaging for the image and value that we placed on being older. And then the second sort of damaging piece about that was then when in the early days, businesses thought it was going to be a much more damaging thing to their business than it was. Obviously, it was hugely damaging, hospitality sector, things like that. But a lot of businesses thrived. More people needed. One of my clients was a beer company. More people were drinking beer, wanted more. And so there were certain companies that literally had more business than ever. But before they knew what was going to happen, a lot of companies just sort of laid people off out of a preponderance of caution for their bottom line and all the rest of that. Well, disproportionately, any layoff affects older people more than younger people. And that's exactly what happened in this case. There was the percentage of older people that were laid off during the pandemic was higher. Interestingly, another thing that nobody sort of predicted or knew was coming as a result of the pandemic was, I think and I'm still waiting for the true positive of this to happen because it hasn't yet, but nobody predicted that we were going to have this Great Resignation, that we were going to kind of have this universal reset about what is important to me and what the role that work should play in my life. And, a lot of people, particularly millennials and younger, were sort of saying, this isn't worth it. Like, I'm not, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to move here and do this. And if they're not going to let me, I'm not going to do it. It just kind of created this mass resignation, this unprecedented job openings, vacancy that was, and it's so interesting to have this conversation because already things are changing, things just are very fluid in our world today. But, for a period of time, the biggest problem that business had was they couldn't get talent. They couldn't get help. And so that's when I wanted to wave, my banner as loud and broadly as I could about, don't forget the people that you let go that were really valuable and good, that might've been over 50, bring them back. And a lot of companies did that. In fact, I talked to an advertising agency that did exactly that. They went back to everybody that had left or early retired or whatever over a certain age and went after them in a very specific way and said, we want you back. We need you back. So like I said, that hasn't been a broad, I would love to say everybody did that. And now we've got all these opportunities it's not quite that broad, but it did in the end have a little bit of a positive effect for some older workers.
Ageism and the effects of ageism in the workplace can happen without people realizing it until it's too late, where you suddenly have a package on your desk and you don't know why. Are there any warning signs at all that people can or should be looking for, that they might be wanting to go, hey, am I being minimized? Is something going on? Is there anything we can look for?
Well, like the example that I shared earlier about, sort of being disincluded or, not being as involved as you felt like you used to be would be one sign. The other thing that I think is really important to do is just observe what's going on. And, and like I said, I wish like when someone is leaving, we tend to not like, oh, what happened if, but I think that it's good to understand, what did happen. And then if you start to notice that, boy, my organization seems to have a pattern here of people when they reach a certain age. I mean, I will say in my own industry, which is the advertising marketing world, you don't see a lot of people over 50. And so I started to notice that in my 40s. And I would say a little bit, my spidey senses were up. And so I think that you can just kind of look around the organization and see if you're not one of those over 50s yourself, like how many other older 50s are there? And if there is, if there are any and you happen to have a relationship, like take them to lunch or like go have coffee, ask them what their experience has been like. Have they felt valued? Do they feel part of it? Do they feel like they have a future? Notice if the other thing is, and I don't have hard and fast statistics about this because it's, proprietary with individual companies, but of the people that I interviewed who were surprised by that package, most of them had not had a meaningful review in years. So their reviews were cursory. Like if they were in a company where you sort of had to do one, had to put one on file, it was clear to them that not a whole lot of time and effort had been put in. Their final score, so to speak, was fine or even good. So it's not like there would have been any clue in the review that said, oh, you got a performance problem. But the clue that you should look for in a review is just not being very thorough. And if we think back to the reviews that we have in our 30s, it almost always has a conversation about what's next for you. Like, where might you go? Or what, here's some development things. Or where do you see yourself in 5 years? Here's where I see you in 5 years. Those conversations stop happening when you hit a certain age. I understand because sometimes, and this is just a word of advice that I have for all of the older workers who want to stay working and engaged as long as they can. You can't expect a promotion all the time. Like there is a certain point where, there may not be another level for you, but if you are still, that doesn't mean there isn't a role for you. And so if you love what you're doing and you value the paycheck and you value the benefits and you want to stay in, just like make sure that you're communicating that you're not always in the market for a huge pay bump or, a next opportunity, that you would actually be very open to considering something that might look and feel very different than sort of the traditional career trajectory that you've been on. But the key is force that conversation. If it's not being brought up to you, you bring it up and make it a comfortable conversation for everybody to talk about. Let's talk about my next 10 years, even though I know retirement is out there for me. Like I know it is out there. I don't know exactly, I might not know exactly when I want it to be, but, when it's this big dark secret that I don't articulate, the company doesn't know or is afraid to ask or doesn't talk about, that's when all this uncomfortable surprise, here's your package, these kinds of things can happen because we haven't just sort of had direct and honest conversations.
I want to touch on something in your latest book that you seem to be, how do I put this? Humming and hawing seems like the worst way to phrase this, but
okay.
Not as comfortable talking about, which is ageism and gender.
Sure.
Which I love your intro to the chapter in the book going, I'm not saying it. Okay, fine. I'm saying it. And just talking about how ageism is much more impactful for women.
Yeah. Probably why you felt the hemming and hawing. That was initially in my first book, that was a purposeful choice because, ageism is truly the one form of discrimination that will affect us all, has the potential to affect us all, regardless of our sexual preferences, our race, our gender, any of those other things. And I frankly wanted people to get good and mad about it. And so I thought the more people that I could get good and mad about it, the better. And so if I don't alienate a group or, spend too much time talking about one group, then, we have this big army that can go to war against ageism. And that probably is a little bit a statement that reflects my sort of age and coming up when I did. I'm 63 years old. So I did come up in my career at a time where gender was an issue, and being too much of a outspoken feminist, you might have lost allies or support, all the rest of that. So I checked my own unconscious bias at the door and realized I was afraid that if I was too female about this issue, I might lose the support of men, which thankfully I think we've come a long way. And so I think that, more men are really great allies. But more candidly, I heard from a lot of women who were like, what the hell? You're a woman. It's worse for us. Why aren't you talking about this? It's worse for us. And then I also, this job that I mentioned to you, where I went back to work during the pandemic, my leadership team then happened to be 90% women. And they happened to be women in their probably late 30s, 40s, who had kids and families and were trying to get through all of this, homeschooling, all of what we had to do and their jobs, all the rest of that. And not that there weren't men that were also struggling and suffering, but the fact is those home duties do tend to fall more to women. So women dropped out of the workforce during the pandemic at a much more significant rate than men, which is actually true in general. It just prior to the pandemic, women who tended to drop out of the workforce did it a little bit more by choice than in the pandemic, when it was just sort of like enough already. And so I just watched these women that worked for me. And I was, an empty nester at the time, although like a lot of empty nesters, my 20-something kid was back home. But, that was different. They were dealing with much more different issues. And I just thought, this is just so hard for them. And if they leave the workforce and come back and want to come back, which, they should, because they're really good at their jobs, now they're going to be 10 years older. They will have missed some of that experience that others will have. And there just are these biases out there. And I talk about lookism in my book. There is no doubt that women are held to different standards about looking old. The same company, not the same boss. I happen to be early gray person. And they said, oh, you're going to color your hair, right? And I did for a while because I thought, well, yeah, I'm only 30. But then I realized later in life, it's natural. Like I look better than I do in a fake black hair, and so I didn't do it. But a lot of women don't make that choice because they don't feel like they can. I wrote about a woman who literally couldn't quantify it, but felt like her hair, she had cancer. I mean, it's even worse reason, her cancer scare really badly. And literally hair went white, like overnight as part of her treatment. And she felt like when she went back to work, everything was different. And she attributed, obviously, some of that to people being worried about her health and all that. But she said a lot of it was people just assumed I was older and just started treating me differently. So I do think that, men never get told you should dye your hair, unless they're maybe in Hollywood or something. But so I do think that, you've got this combination of lookism, choices that women have to make in higher numbers than men that may force them out of the workplace temporarily and then entering it back as an older person. I wrote a little bit about menopause, which I had never even, I'm ashamed to admit, the first time around, I never even thought about it. Like it just wasn't in my, set of considerations. But I realized after doing a little bit of research that for a lot of women in their 50s and 60s, they're dealing with this very natural, normal, everybody goes through it, health condition in a workplace that isn't allowed to even acknowledge or talk about it. So if I hemmed and hawed, I think it's because I'm still feeling guilty that I didn't address it more head on and more directly in my first book, because it's real. It's definitely real. But I always feel like I just have to say this because I've known many men who I care deeply about and have gotten to know through the course of my book. It is not just women. Men can be unfairly treated as a result of their age as well.
No, and I found it a really interesting chapter, and I'm glad you took the time in this edition to add that angle to it as well. What do we say to those? And you highlighted that most people that are ageist or ageism in an organization are those on the tier, if we're looking at a hierarchical organization, the tier just below. So I'm in their head going, well, how am I supposed to advance if the people above me don't ever retire? I've seen it in organizations where they're like, I can't move up because that person loves their job so much, or they never want to, just looking at that as it's almost a ceiling based on people not leaving. What do you say to those people that are ambitious and see that as a barrier?
Well, part of the reason that I wanted to focus my book on the workplace is because I would actually like to have the conversation with those people's bosses, or their management structure. But what I would say to them is like, look, you got to work with your management, because I get it. I totally get it. And I have always believed I pride myself on the fact that I think, I care more about the people working for me than I do myself. And so I have always believed that sometimes you have to get out of the way, just sort of make room for somebody else. But what I came to understand as I got older is, but that doesn't mean that the organization shouldn't work really hard to find something meaningful and valuable for a lot of us to do, so that we can make room, so that we can go do that and make room for these people who might want our title or our position or something like that. I'll use my own personal example. I had a really good job, was running the agency that I'd worked at for, a couple different times, but for many years. I loved my job. I loved the people that work for me. I was like in it every day, up to my eyeballs in P&L and people management and client issues and all these things. And my then boss came to me and asked me to take another job. And it could have all been the happy ending that I just alluded to, but it wasn't, because the job wasn't very well conceived. It didn't sound like a real job. I went from having like lots and lots of people working for me to like nobody with no real, but it was just like, and so I said, no, thanks. I'll stay. No, I'm going to stay where, I like my job. I'll stay where I am. Well, I didn't know at the time that he had actually promised my job to somebody else already, who had been given another job offer. So, it was sort of like, to get this person not to leave. Oh, well, you can run Chicago. I've got something else in mind for Patti. You can run Chicago. Oh, great. I'll stay. So this other person says, so when I say I won't leave, I don't know anything, about that. And he was all of a sudden had a problem and was like, oh shit, now what am I going to do? And out of, I think, frustration and anger, said to me, well, this is a good job. I'm not docking your pay. How much longer do you want to work anyway? And that was the first time in my life I had ever thought, oh my God, this ageism shit is happening to me. Like he thinks I'm not going anywhere. He thinks I'm done. And that ended up sort of being the long way out. I ultimately sort of left the company, but how that could have been handled is exactly what I think companies need to do today. And I'll go back to my review. I was another one of those people that, reviews were cursory, not a whole lot. I always got a great review, but never really any sort of discussion about what was next. And I wasn't really, worried about that. But if he would have said to me, look, so-and-so, I really want to develop that person. They're great. Don't you think they're great? We really need them in the company. Your job, this job, running this office, is sort of a key thing that somebody needs to do if they're really going to advance. But you're doing a great job. And I know this is what you're doing. So can we, what else would you like to do? Let's figure something else out. And by the way, Patti, how much longer do you think you want to work? Like, you're really good, you're really valuable, but how much longer do you think, how old are you? The whole thing could have been different. And I might have said, well, gee, I hadn't really thought about how much longer I want to work, but probably at this pace or level, maybe another 5 years, but then I'd like to, it could have been this happy ending instead of me feeling pushed out, undervalued. It was awful. It was just awful. So that's what I would say to this person who's waiting for somebody to step out of their job, is like, they'll step out of their job as long as they've got someplace good to step into. So why don't you be a part of the solution to sort of try to create these jobs? And I came up with a list one time of like a bunch of different things that I thought people with experience could do inside of corporations that just require a little bit of creative thinking and thinking differently. And it's not always like, like you said, this linear progression. Like in my world, first you're an assistant account executive, then you're an account executive, let's think not about titles, but about value that can be created inside of the organization. And I guarantee you, if you think about it that way, you'll come up with some opportunities that somebody who's over 50 and isn't gunning for their next promotion would be great at, would really be great at.
So let's fix this problem, Patti. How does an organization embrace their older employees? How do we avoid the path of ageism in an organization? Do you have a few examples you'd provide?
Well, yeah. One I love because it was actually a company that was in an agency that was in my first book, anonymously, as a negative example. And then in my second as a positive example. And they realized that they might have an issue. And one of their leaders in HR read my book. I might have suspected, that they were one of the stories I was telling, but they invited me to come and speak. And I spoke they would do this annual event, something like Diversity and Inclusion Days, or I can't remember. But for the first time in their history, which was over like 60 years, included age as one of the topics. And so prior to that, they did what I recommend every company do, was they just do an employee census to just sort of understand the ages of the people that work for you. And they realized, oh my God, we are so weighted here and we hardly have anybody that is in this older cohort. And by the way, we have clients who are selling products to this older cohort. So it would really behoove us to have more people in this age group. So that was the first thing they did. Like, okay, we got a problem. And then by inviting me in, they were willing to say, we have a problem. And, here's somebody that's got some expertise that can help us to do it. And then the next thing that they did was that I am starting to see a few more companies do it, but they actually created, and they have lots of different names and organizations, but like employee resource group or a cohort, a group of people, they called it SAGES. And it was intended to be for 40 and over workers to sort of come together and talk about the organization and the issues that they face as an older segment of the workforce at this particular institution. And what I love most about it is then it became, it was always open to everybody, but then it became truly this cross-generational group representing everybody from their 20s, and as I think I said at the outset, we could potentially right now have a workforce with 5 generations of employees. So you had people representing every generation coming together. And one of the stories they told me that I loved is they would say, like, explain why your generation thinks Citizen Kane was such a great movie, or explain why, and so they would, sort of have fun with some of the different life experiences they had, but also mentor each other up and down. And so I think that that's like just two quick and easy things companies can do is just look around, be open and honest. Do we have a problem? Are we mostly, geared towards a younger workforce? And can we do better? Create an employee resource group. The other thing is, we talked about this too. Like, it is this feeling of being marginalized. Like, I had a lot of people literally use the word invisible to me. I started to just feel invisible. That literally hurts my heart when I hear that, because I'm like, none of us want to feel invisible, And so I would also just say, if I was a leader in an organization you don't even have to be a leader to do this. If you see somebody that's an older worker, and you can define that with whatever number you want, just sit down and talk to them and make them, and learn from their experiences, share yours, just make them feel welcome and part of the organization.
Are you still optimistic, Patti? You are certainly an optimist, but you mentioned at the top that people are, oh yeah, it should be part of the diversity conversation. But is the needle moving enough for you to still be optimistic that we're addressing this properly?
Well, that's a tough question. It is moving very slowly for sure. But I am optimistic because I do think that it's like the old airport security. If you see something, say something. I think just the more that we are getting people like you to do, who focus on workplace things, to focus on this topic, we're just slowly but surely we're going to get it. I'm also optimistic because I did a interview with 2 graduate students right before the holidays who are doing a unit on D&I issues in the world of marketing. And so they appropriately, were directed by their professor, you should consider age and you should read her book and talk to Patti. And so we did this. And one of them's mother was going through something like this. And this young woman was outraged and so like couldn't imagine how her mother, who she knew had been, worked hard and valuable and all the rest of that, could sort of end up in this place in her career. And I thought, we have a whole generation now of people, several generations, I think, who are working, who grew up with working parents, career-oriented parents. So they see and saw like how much these careers meant to their parents. And so I just think it will, like, they will just sort of maybe approach it with this, of course, everybody should have the right to work as long as they want, as long as they're good. So I'm, I know nothing other than maybe some gut intuitions, a few conversations I've had, but that I do think that this generation, this newest generation that's entered the workforce, maybe will help drive some change.
I'm going to finish it all up with the last question, which is, what's one simple action people can do right now to improve those relationships at work?
Make sure that you are building relationships with people who are not like you. So I think it is human nature and natural that we tend to form groups with the people that we are most like. But I would say, go out of your way to pick somebody who on the surface seems the opposite of you and build that relationship. And I guarantee you will learn more and be more fulfilled as a result.
That's Patti Temple Rocks. She's the author of I'm Still Not Done. It's time to talk about ageism in the workplace. Thank you so much, Patti, for being here.
Thank you, Russell.
And that'll do it for another episode of Relationships at Work, the Employee Experience and Workplace Culture podcast. If you like the stories, the information, the brain expansion, well, I really ask if you'd go over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, and if they have the option to rate and review, pretty please do. It's how podcasts get found. It's how they get worked around in the algorithm. I don't know. I'm no scientist, but it does help get the word out about the podcast. And I'd really appreciate you taking that moment to give it a 5-star, give it a few kudos in the text form. Anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Take care.